In one book and chapters in the other book, Aronson and Gilovich parallel one another pretty much. This is the only chapter that really doesn't. I looked up most of the information in this chapter, and most of it is in chapters 3, 4, 11, and 12, strangely enough. So I apologize for that. This one doesn't quite fit, but we're going to go ahead and do chapter 5. So here we go. That's why I kept it until the very end. There's a subtle connection between what is happening in the world around us and what's going on in our heads. Hopefully there is, anyway. Otherwise, you're not aware of reality, I guess. Social surroundings tend to affect self-awareness. Depending on who we are and where we are, each individual is aware of the differences between themselves and everyone else. Self-interest colors social judgment. People tend not to be objective or dispassionate when they're dealing with a situation they're involved in. Self-concern motivates social behavior. People do things for their own selves and often function to please or impress society at large. Self-awareness is a state of focused attention on the self. Self-awareness is associated with activity in the anterior cingulate cortex. Self-awareness develops in humans at about 18 months of age. Some animals, but not many, show self-awareness. Wolves and other pack animals don't seem to have self-awareness. In other words, canines, dogs, wolves, foxes, coyotes. William James was a psychologist, philosopher, and physician. In his Principles of Psychology, printed in 1890, he described the development of the self. Emotional identification with an object makes it part of your self-concept. The self changes over time. George Herbert Mead was a philosopher, sociologist, and psychologist. In The Genesis of Self and Social Control that he wrote in 1925, Mead wrote that the self emerges through symbolic interactions. It internalizes the view of the generalized other. People can be socialized in multiple cultural frameworks, moving from one place to another, parents from different cultural backgrounds, living in a subculture with different values than the dominant culture. These are all forms of biculturalism. People with multiple cultural identities engage in cultural frame switching in response to situational cues. Sometimes they act as one culture, and sometimes they act as if they are in the other culture. A famous American proverb is, "The squeaky wheel gets the grease." This means that the more you make yourself known, stand out, or unique, or complain, the more attention you will get. And of course, the whole point of the proverb is be unique. And, okay, that's the United States. A famous Japanese proverb, "The nail that stands out gets pounded down." This means that if you are unique or stand out in any way, the culture will force you to conform. Be like everyone else. Gender identification of the self as a male is the identification of the self as a male or a female. In North American cultures, women are socialized toward relational self-concepts. Men are socialized toward independent self-concepts. These self-concepts refer to emotional connectedness to others, not the role of self within the group. Age-related stages, unexamined the ethnic identity formation. Unexamined ethnic identity This is when you're young, you have not thought out your own ethnic self-concept. You may internalize negative stereotypes about your own group. And ethnic identity search, this is when you get a little bit older, maybe you go to college. You explore your ethnicity through cultural events, reading, etc. You may reject anything dealing with the dominant culture. And then as you get older, you achieve ethnic identity, you appreciate your ethnic heritage, you internalize beneficial values while separating self from damaging aspects of group identity. And having lived in a multicultural world for an extended length of time, for 73 years, and being in the service, and watching this process take place, I can tell you that this is exactly how it works, and it happens at different ages for different ethnic groups, for different individuals. I've had friends who were African American when they were in high school. They had unexamined ethnic identity. As soon as they went away to college, they became imbued with their own culture, and at that point, they formed an ethnic identity where they rejected the dominant culture. Really kind of interesting. When I first went to Wabash, I had all these friends. I had lots of friends when I was there, and some of them were African American. But after we'd been there for about, I don't know, 3 or 4 months, there was a general rejection of people that were the African Americans. There was this general rejection of people that were not African American. They tried to start their own group, and actually they were able to start the Malcolm X Institute. Uh, but it was really kind of curious because here we were all working together and we were all interacting, and then all of a sudden there was this rejection. And then by the end of the year, they had understood who they were, and so they were beginning to re-embrace the people that had supported them, the non-African Americans who had supported them in their endeavors, and that was the achieved ethnic identity. Strategic self-presentation is the process of presenting the self in particular ways to shape others' impressions. It requires self-regulation. Failure in self-presentation leads to embarrassment. It can become automatic with practice. Common types of self-presentation: ingratiation, the flatterer. This is commonly used to gain acceptance. Modesty increases likability but not perceived competence. So if you are one of those modest people, this is you're far more likable. Self-promotion, used when competence is highly valued. And of course, it's really kind of curious. You start working at an institution, and you go to your first faculty association meeting, or you go to your first faculty meeting, and everybody's trying to establish their academic credentials, and they're bragging about where they went to college, and where they got their PhD, and that kind of stuff. It's really kind of curious to watch. And if you understand what's going on, you just kind of, oh, okay, well, we won't worry about this today. everybody's got to brag about who they are, and then and of course, if you accepted all that as for first impressions, you probably wouldn't have any friends among the faculty. But eventually everyone comes around and stops bragging about their dissertation being accepted as a textbook for whatever. Exemplification: show your integrity and moral worthiness. Intimidation, used for coercion. So you show off your muscles Self-handicapping involves placing obstacles in the way of one's own performance in order to protect or enhance the individual's self-concept. An individual's idea of who they are defines their self-concept. Schemas are mental frameworks that individuals use to organize and categorize the world. Self-schemas are the mental frameworks that we maintain when we think about ourselves. For example, if we see ourselves as athletic, then not only will this be our definition of ourselves, but it will influence what we focus on in ourselves and in others. People tend to process information and remember information related to themselves more readily than any other. This is known as self-reference effect. For most people, the most important thing to them is, well, themselves. Research done where individuals were singled out by having them wear clothing that they weren't used to showed that they felt as if everyone was watching them, and this is known as the spotlight effect. Why were people watching them? Because they didn't like the clothes that they were wearing. It's like having a pimple on your face. You think that everybody's looking at your pimple specifically because of the unattractiveness of it, because you see it as being unattractive. Most people probably don't even notice. It's known as the spotlight effect. An individual's self-schema does not only include who they are, but who and what they would like to be, or fear we might become. These are our possible selves. It is this vision of who we would like to be and who we could possibly become that drives us forward, or keeps us from getting a butcher knife and chopping up our in-laws. Because these are our possible selves. You may see yourself as a doctor, or you may see yourself as a PhD teaching this class and doing a much better job than I am. And that's fine. Those are your possible selves. And that's okay. You can see that. Hopefully you don't have some kind of monster in there that where you fantasize about killing people. That is another possible self. Three aspects of self-concept: actual self, the ideal self, and the ought self. A discrepancy between actual self and ideal or ought leads to particular emotions. Actual ideal discrepancy leads to dejection, related emotions. Actual ought discrepancies leads to agitation, related emotions. Emotional reactions tend to be stronger when related to an important self aspect. So the actual self, of course, is who you actually are. The ideal self is an iconic figure, and the ought self is the person that you feel like you ought to be. So if you cheated on an exam, your ought self would be the person that didn't cheat on the exam. The actual self would be the guy that used ChatGPT to write his paper. The ought self is the one that wrote it themselves. The ideal self is the individual that doesn't need to use ChatGPT to get a good paper. I hope all of that makes a lot of sense. This all has to do with the id, the ego, and the superego. Freud's idea of the three aspects of the human brain. The actual self is the id. The ideal self is the superego, and the ought self is the ego. That was about as clear as mud. Anyway, so when the actual self is who we actually are, the ideal self is our iconic figure, and the ought self is just getting by, just a little bit better than who we actually are. Discrepancies, of course, in all of these selves cause agitation. An individual's self-esteem is their overall self-evaluation and sense of self-worth. Self-esteem influences how we approach and respond to life challenges. Self-esteem is the evaluation of one's self-concept. Most people regard themselves more positively than they do their peers. The better than average effect. People with low self-esteem seem to be more adversely affected by negative life events than people with high self-esteem. Self-enhancement and self-verification motives conflict in low self-esteem persons. It appears that the self-enhancement motive operates in response to a person's feelings, while self-verification operates in response to a person's thoughts. The two motives operate on different time courses. The affective route is quicker, but the cognitive route is more persistent. The two motives serve as checks and balances on each other. Only in cases of maladjustment does one motive strongly dominate the other. Studies suggest that the self-enhancement motive is weaker in collectivist societies than in individualist societies. So this conflict may be an artifact of individualist culture. There is a dark side to high self-esteem. People with high self-esteem may react with greater aggression than others when someone challenges their favorable self-assessments. The stability of high self-esteem seems to determine whether threats to self-esteem lead to aggression. Unstable self-esteem may come from conflicts between explicit and implicit self-esteem. High explicit self-esteem and low implicit self-esteem are together associated with narcissism. In Greek mythology, Narcissus fell in love with his own reflection in a pool of water and was so fond of his own image that he couldn't leave and eventually died. Today, narcissism refers to the combination of excessive self-love and a lack of empathy toward others. Now, the idea was that Narcissus was so pretty that one of the goddesses fell in love with him. And when he didn't reciprocate her love, then she cursed him to look at his reflection until he turned to stone, I think. I think he's turned to stone. Anyway, the goddess punished him for being so self-centered. And there you go. That's what a narcissist is. Now, a narcissist not only loves themselves, but they also lack empathy toward others. The top red line shows average scores for college students on the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, a common measure of narcissism from the years 1980 to 2008. The bottom blue line shows a percentage of first-person pronouns, for example, I, me, mine, in the lyrics of the 10 most popular songs of the year from 1980 to 2007. As you can see, there has been a steady increase in both measures over time, suggesting that narcissism may be increasing. Our social self is made up of roles we play. Each aspect of our lives requires different actions and thoughts. We're a parent, we're a student, we're an extended family member. Our social identity, each individual identifies themselves by their extended social roles. We're Americans, we're church members of one ilk or another. We are ethnic group members. Social comparisons. In order to understand what we are in the world, individuals must compare themselves to other people in the society. This not only includes abilities, but opinions as well. Success and failure, self-concept is strongly affected by whether we are successful in what we attempt. Other people's judgments, when our achievements are recognized, it builds our self-esteem. We compare ourselves to others to gain information to provide motivation. People who make you feel good about yourself are either less competent than you at something important to you, that's social comparison, or more talented than you at something irrelevant to your self-concept. And this is known as social reflection. Depending on where and how you are raised determines your view of self. People raised in the Western culture tend to be more individualistic than people raised in Eastern cultures. People from Eastern cultures tend to be more collectivistic. As confusing as this may seem, people can be individualistic in some aspects of their lives and collectivistic in others. Mort was adamantly conservative. This basically meant that he was economically individualistic, but morally he was a collectivist. His pencil-neck liberal neighbor was the very opposite. Self-efficacy is the sense that we are competent and effective in our lives. Research on self-efficacy in health shows that people who felt competent and effective in their lives are more persistent, less anxious, less depressed, more healthy, more academically successful. People who have self-efficacy tend to set more challenging goals, persist in the face of difficulty, predict productivity, keep calm and seek solutions when problems arise. Striving plus persistent equals accomplishment. With accomplishment, self-confidence grows. Self-efficacy grows with hard-won achievements. Research dealing with the self-efficacy of older adults found that when given positive images of being older adults in the West actually did better on memory tests than those who were given negative images. In Asia, where positive images prevail, memory decline is less acute. Feeling of competence is not the only factor of success. An individual must also feel that they have control over the outcome of their fate to be successful. Locus of control is the second factor in predicting success. Locus of control is the extent to which people perceive outcomes as internally controllable by their own efforts and actions, or as externally controlled by chance or outside forces. And this is one of the things that we discovered in Vietnam. The people that, the individuals that were the lower ranking individuals who had no control over anything in their lives were the ones that developed PTSD. And the reason they developed PTSD is because they had an external locus of control. And since they had an external locus of control, they felt that they were out of control the whole time, that they didn't have any power to dictate what would happen to them. And they developed PTSD. The other thing about people developing PTSD, the ones who had already experienced a trauma in their lives were the ones that developed the worst PTSD. Studies with dogs back in the 70s by Seligman showed that when confronted with a persistent negative situation where the creature had no means of escape, the creature would remain paralyzed even when escape was possible. Researchers note that humans in depressed or oppressed situations often displayed the same attitude. Let me explain to you what this experiment was all about. These grids on the floor are charged with electricity, and this grid was electrocuted the dog's feet, and this one did not. So if the dog was put in the left-hand chamber where they would be electrocuted, and this was blocked off, the dog would incur an electric charge in their feet, which was relatively painful. So then the experiment was that they had the dog over here, and the dog couldn't escape, and so the dog was being electrocuted. And later they took the same, not electrocuted to death, of course. They were just, it was painful for them. So later what they did, they made this opening, and then they electrocuted the dog. But the dog, instead of jumping over the hurdle to get to the area that where they weren't being electrocuted, they stayed over here. They had learned that they were helpless, that there was nothing that they could do. So they just stayed over here, despite the fact that there was an opening. That's known as learned helplessness. Seligman's work with dogs has given us the concept of self of learned helplessness. Researchers note that humans in depressed or oppressed situations often display the same attitude: paralysis of will, passive resignation, motionless apathy. And that's what happened with the dog. Despite the fact that they were being electrocuted, that they were being shocked, the dogs did not try to leave. They just stayed right there. Unfortunately, learned helplessness may come into play in real life circumstances. In many institutionalized settings where there is little choice for free will, learned helplessness may be the product. If this occurs in a hospital or nursing home setting, the learned helplessness may affect the individual's health or their chance for survival. Hospital patients who are trained to believe that they control stress require fewer pain relievers and sedatives and exhibit less anxiety. While having no choices is debilitating, having too many choices can be paralyzing. Research shows that people are more satisfied with choices when the number of choices are limited. Research also shows that people who are more satisfied with their choices when making a choice that is irreversible. The possibility of change gives individuals the idea that there may be something better that they didn't try. The grass is always greener on the other side of the hill. Most people maintain a self-serving bias or the tendency to perceive themselves favorably. Such ideas allows individuals to interpret negative events as someone else's fault and positive events that may have happened through chance as due completely to their own positive attributes. Failures are externally caused, while successes are internally caused. In one study from Canada of young married couples, researchers discovered that males felt that they did more housework than their wives gave them credit for. However, at the same time, the wives took credit for more of the housework than they actually performed. Each group participated in self-serving bias, but unfortunately, this self-serving bias caused marital discord. Self-serving bias is evident in academia as well. When students do well on an exam, not only was it their hard work that allowed them to do well, but the test was a true measure of the material. When students do poorly, it is usually because of the instructor. However, instructors are just as bad. Successes are due to their ability to teach, and failure is due to a poor student, not the quality of instruction. Most business people see themselves as more ethical than the average business person. 90% of business managers rate themselves superior to their average peer. High school students rate themselves as more honest, persistent, original, and reliable than the average student. Most drivers consider themselves above average drivers. Most people perceive themselves as more intelligent than their average peer, better looking, and much less prejudiced. Most adults believe that they support their aging parents more than do their siblings. Los Angeles residents view themselves as healthier than most of their neighbors, and most college students believe they will outlive their actuarially predicted death by about 10 years. No matter what statistics might say to the contrary, most people see their community, state, and region as similar to that described by Garrison Keillor of Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. Most people practice some degree of unrealistic optimism, seeing the future as only holding good things. While unrealistic optimism may keep us going forward, sometimes it can get us into trouble. Many people see themselves as immune to misfortune and do not prepare themselves for it. While everyone marries for eternity, half of all marriages in Western society end in divorce. People shun seatbelts, they deny the effects of smoking, they don't consistently use contraceptives, they swear that they can change an undesirable partner. People who are optimistic about a positive self-efficacy, better health, and more solid well-being than a pessimist. People who are optimistic have a positive self-efficacy, better health, and more solid well-being than a pessimist. Optimism allows us to believe that happiness continues around the corner. However, a dash of realism, what Julie Norum calls defensive pessimism, can keep people's eyes open to the possibility of negatives. And that's that one of those negatives would be if you're a smoker, if you drive while you're intoxicated, if you lack of contraception and poor seatbelt use. During the Nixon administration, Richard Nixon would give speeches praising the silent majority. These were the conservatives in the country that backed his conservative policies as compared to the vocal minority that picketed Washington on a daily basis. Nixon assumed that most people favored his ideas. This is false consensus effect, the tendency to overestimate the commonality of one's opinions and one's undesirable or unsuccessful behaviors. Just as people tend to assume that everyone has similar ideas to them, people also tend to overestimate their abilities to see their actions as unique. This is known as the false uniqueness effect. False consensus is an overestimation of others. False uniqueness is an underestimation of others. We practice cognitive conceit, overestimate the accuracy of our beliefs and judgments, and misremember our own past in self-enhancing ways. If we cannot misremember an event, then we will probably try to justify it. The more favorably we see ourselves in a select dimension, the more likely we are to use the dimension to judge others. The more favorably we view ourselves, the more we will think others perceive us in flattering ways. If a piece of information flatters us, then we believe it and we evaluate positively both the test and any evidence suggesting that the test is valid. We bask in reflected glory of someone we are acquainted to. If linked with a negative person, we soften our view of that select individual. Research shows that when a person with high self-esteem faces failure, they tend to maintain their self-worth by perceiving others as failing and by exaggerating their superiority over others. While sibling rivalry is not universal, when brothers are close in age or sisters are close in age, people tend to compare them. If one is markedly more able than the other, there tends to be conflict. When facing a romantic rival, an individual is more likely to feel jealousy if their rival's achievements are in the same general field of their own aspirations. Why are relationships so important to our self-esteem? Despite how individualistic we may think we are, social relationships are a gauge of social acceptance or rejection. Social acceptance is conducive to thriving and survival. Low self-esteem predicts an increased risk of depression, drug abuse, and some forms of delinquency. Research shows that when faced with failure, people with high self-esteem are more likely to react with aggression. Roy Baumeister has done a great deal of work with self-esteem and finds that people with high self-esteem are more likely to be obnoxious, to interrupt, and to talk at people rather than to them. Talk at rather than to. By making excuses for ourselves, it helps to protect us from depression. While depressed people may make more accurate appraisals of themselves, the negative thinking tends to mire them deeper in depression. Better to be deluded than sad, perhaps? Research shows that maintaining a high self-esteem, even when there is evidence to the contrary, reduces an individual's anxiety, even in the face of continuing threats. Most university sorority members perceive those in their sorority as far less likely to be conceited and snobby than those in other sororities. 2/3 of Americans feel that their child's public school is good, while seeing the nation's public schools as unable to teach. Most executives overpredict their firm's ability to produce. Such self-serving bias can lead an individual to gamble away their paycheck, having faith in their own good fortune, Such self-serving bias will permit an individual to open a doomed business without proper background capital. Such self-serving bias possibly took the United States into Vietnam, the Soviets into Afghanistan, and even U.S. forces into Iraq. Self-presentation is the person that we present to others. False modesty is the facade that people may present when they feel superior to someone else. This may take the form of insulting yourself, fishing for reassurance or praise. It also may be used to keep others from becoming envious or resentful. I used to be vain and proud, but now I'm so humble. I must be a saint, at least a saint. Sometimes people sabotage their chances for success by creating impediments that make success less likely. This self-handicapping serves to protect the individual from dealing with failure. The failure is due to their own handicap, not their lack of ability. Just as people attribute their failures on external causes, they themselves may choose to place the impediment as a form of self-protection. Examples of self-handicapping: reducing preparation for important individual athletic events, giving one's opponent an advantage, report feeling depressed, performing poorly at the beginning of a task in order not to create unreachable expectations, not trying as hard as they could during a tough, ego-involving task. Impression management is a self-presentation. Self-presentation often happens without conscious effort, especially with someone new or with members of the opposite sex. We tend to put our best foot forward and attempt to make an impression on them. Self-monitoring, being attuned to the way one presents oneself in social situations and adjusting one's performance to create the desired impression. Some people are high self-monitors, while others are low self-monitors. Some people will readily adjust their behavior to their circumstance and the individuals that they are around. Some social settings dictate that the individual adjusts their behavior to fit the social setting. One problem with people who are high self-monitors: they may espouse one idea in one circumstance and the opposite in another. High self-monitors are social chameleons. Self-monitoring is the tendency to use cues from other people's self-presentation in controlling our own self-presentations. High self-monitors are skilled impression managers. And that is a picture of my grandson when he was 2. And there he is with his mom. He's 12 now, so that was 10 years ago. And there you go.